chemical agriculture and critics of GMOs to basically try to discredit them, to make their arguments invalid. And they had memberships and they had secret profiles of people. And it really was like a dirty little tricks, bag of dirty little tricks, kind of CIA operate, like a very in the dark.
Welcome back to another episode of the Peak Performance Life podcast. Today, I am very excited to be getting into a fascinating topic. I think you will find it very, very interesting. We have on the line with us Carey Gillam. She is a veteran investigative journalist with more than 30 years of experience covering U.S. news, including 17 years as a senior correspondent with Reuters International News Service. She is the author of two amazing books. One of them is called Whitewash: The Story of a Weed Killer, Cancer, and the Corruption of Science, an expose of Monsanto's corporate corruption of agriculture. This book won the coveted Rachel Carson Book Award from the Society of Environmental Journalists in 2018. And her second book, a narrative legal thriller titled The Monsanto Papers, was released in 2021 as well. So she's also contributed chapters to a book about environmental journalism and a book about pesticide use in Africa. That's a topic that I definitely want to touch on as well. And she regularly writes for The Guardian. Her work's also been published in the New York Times, Huffington Post, and many other outlets. Carey, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I mean, this is pretty incredible work that you've been doing here. I guess let's start with a little bit of a background of how did you get into this work that you're doing now with, like, you know, regarding health and kind of the things that you've seen going on in the industry?
Sure. Well, it was not by design. I can say that. I worked for Reuters, which your listeners may know is a big international news agency, one of the oldest and largest in the world. And I was covering the financial industry, big banks, living on the East Coast, and thought that that was the biggest, best, most important thing I should be doing. And then circumstances changed, and I moved to Kansas City. Reuters wanted me to cover Monsanto and other players in the food and farming agricultural field. Monsanto at that time was revolutionizing agriculture because they had just rolled out genetically engineered crops, which a lot of people are familiar with, the controversy over those GMO crops, the genetic tinkering, if you will, with Mother Nature, as some people describe it. And it really was changing the way farmers did their business and changing the inputs and how much time they had to devote and markets for these types of foods around the world. So it was a very big deal, and I kind of got thrown into it. I wasn't very excited about trading in my business suits and high heels for blue jeans and mud boots. But I actually came to really appreciate it pretty quickly and have come to believe, I think I even have this on my website, that there really is no more important industry or more important topic, at least in my opinion, than how we grow our food and how we feed our families. And, agriculture is, of course, at the very root, pun intended, of all of that. And the pesticides, the chemicals that we use in conventional agriculture, the types of crops that are being grown, the policies around agriculture, it's really, really big business. There's a lot that goes on behind the scenes, behind the curtains that people don't know about, that is not necessarily very good for our health, for our environment, for our wallets, for our future generations. So, it's a long answer, I guess, to a quick question, but it really was just by assignment by Reuters that I got into this, and I just never left it because I've come to be very passionate, obviously, about public health and environmental health and what kind of world we're leaving, our kids.
That's right. That's right. I mean, yeah, some of this stuff is just absolutely crazy. Things that are outlawed in other countries that we're still allowing here in the United States. So, yeah, let's talk a little bit, maybe for people who, I think we've all heard about Monsanto, the GMO, they settled lawsuits, but what's a little bit more behind the scenes, like for the person who's really hasn't heard the whole story? What are some of the important things for people to know and that you've written about in your books about what Monsanto did?
Sure. Well, Monsanto, really is not a freestanding independent company anymore. It was purchased in 2018 by the German company Bayer, the big pharmaceutical giant, which is much more than a pharmaceutical company, but that's what they're known for. They purchased Monsanto in 2018 and absorbed them, but many people still know that name. It was a more than 100-year-old company that had a lot of different products, different industrial applications in the early part of the 19th century, 20th century. And they eventually, after the war, they were involved, in products for warfare. They were involved in Agent Orange. After the war, like many other companies, they looked for different purposes for their chemicals and their solvents. And one thing that they identified, as did many others in that sector, was agriculture as an avenue that would be great for their chemical products. And they developed what came to be the world's most widely used weed killer, which is a chemical called glyphosate. And they developed Roundup and other herbicides based on this weed killing chemical called glyphosate. It was magical for many people. It killed weeds really effectively, very efficiently, killed them down to the root, and farmers thought it was the most wonderful thing. Homeowners around the world have used this, and they came up then with this ingenious strategy in the 1990s as their patent on glyphosate was expiring. They came up with this strategy to develop crops or to change the DNA in certain crops to make them tolerant of glyphosate so that you could spray this chemical right over the top of these plants, these crops, and the crops would not die, they would flourish, but the weeds around them would die. And this Roundup Ready system took over North American agriculture and then rapidly in South America and many other countries around the world who would allow it. But there were all these concerns about the crops and about the increased use of this chemical on the crops because you're leaving residues then in the food that people are eating. So then you have this weed killer in your snacks and in your bread and in the baby food that you're feeding your kids, the oatmeal. So this was just, again, I guess too much of a long answer, but this really intrigued me, how you could follow one company and kind of one product and then this technology and how it was really impacting what we're consuming all over the world. Monsanto became the world's largest seed company and was dominating in the chemical agriculture space as well, really having a very heavy hand in food and farming. And, over time, as I'm covering this, I spent time in Monsanto's headquarters working for Reuters. They very much wanted to court me. They wanted to woo me and teach me how to write about their business and write about, this technology. And so I did. I got to know a lot of the people there. I spent a lot of time there. I came to find out that, what was going on behind the scenes was very different from what the public knew it to be. And that eventually became my first book, Whitewash, which is exactly what the title says. Things were being whitewashed or made to seem much, much better than they actually were.
Yeah, and I think that's an important thing. What you noted about GMO crops is the fact that they're made to withstand very heavy pesticide spraying. I think some people might say, oh, genetically modified. Well, some people, maybe you can make a claim that maybe people in Africa who don't have any food, GMO crops or whatever it is. But I think the part that people may fail to realize is that these are genetically modified to withstand very heavy pesticide spraying. And that's why you want to really avoid them. I want to ask you, and again, for people who, because I heard about the lawsuit, they settled for whatever it was, billions of dollars or hundreds of millions of dollars. Can you fill everyone in on what was actually, how much have they settled and why did they have to settle and pay out all these monies on these lawsuits? What was actually proven that they were hiding?
Yeah, so when you're talking about lawsuits, I assume you're talking about the Roundup cancer litigation, which just really was an explosion of lawsuits filed primarily in the U.S., but Canada, Australia, and other places. This is after, so part of the work that I was doing as glyphosate or Roundup became much more heavily used because of these genetically engineered crops, researchers around the world started to really study it more and say, what does this do to us? We should understand it more. It's the most widely used weed killer. We need to know the impacts it could have on human health. And the science developed showing a very distinct connection to a number of diseases and illnesses, but primarily non-Hodgkin lymphoma, a type of cancer, blood cancer. And in 2015, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, which is part of the World Health Organization, studied all of this different literature that had been published and peer-reviewed over many, many years, and determined that when you took all the weight of evidence in, it looked like a probable human carcinogen with the specific link to non-Hodgkin lymphoma. And after that, there was this explosion from all of these people that had this cancer that had been using glyphosate or Roundup products for so many years. And it came to be over 100,000 cases in the United States alone.
Wow.
So good old Monsanto, you got to hand it to them. The first trial took place, and this is what my second book is about. The very first trial began in June of 2018. Well, what happened in June of 2018? Monsanto's CEO and other executives handed the reins over to Bayer, pocketed, millions of dollars in cash and their golden parachutes, and they took off for the hills and left Bayer holding the bag. And, immediately after the first trial, in which there was a $289 million verdict in favor of the groundskeeper with cancer, Bayer stock plummeted. Shareholders were up in arms, and it's been a mess for them really ever since. So to answer your question, there have been a number of verdicts. The cases continue, trials continue. Bayer has announced an $11 billion settlement to try to settle as many cases as it can. There have been subsequent amounts added to that. The company is still battling. What they're trying to do right now, they've been trying to put a real final endpoint on the litigation, because glyphosate is still being sold. People are still getting cancer. People are still filing lawsuits. So what they're trying to do right now, and they've been trying to do for the past couple of years, is get legislation passed that essentially would preempt all of these lawsuits and would basically make it so that no one could go to court to try to get any accountability if they feel that their disease was caused by this chemical. So, we'll see. It's a new administration. It's a new day. They've not been successful yet, but they may be. We don't know.
Yeah. Hopefully RFK gets on them.
Bobby Kennedy is one of the attorneys who was involved in that litigation and in the first lawsuit. Yeah, very much.
Oh, nice. Oh, that's good. Yeah.
And one of the, I think a point we should make a big part of all of this, and that I talked about in Whitewash in my first book, which was one of the greatest honors, and in addition to the awards, I guess, is that Monsanto really didn't want that book to be used as evidence in court, and so much so that they filed a motion with the judge to keep it from being used in court. But what I was able to expose in Whitewash, and then more so in the second book, was all of these internal documents that showed not only the scientific evidence that links this chemical to cancer, but all the documented conversations and strategies and plans and programs that Monsanto put in place to hide the science, to lie about the science, to confuse people about the science. It was a very specific, dedicated, expensive, they spent millions of dollars to manipulate the science. The corruption of science is in the title of the book. Ghostwriting scientific papers, working in collusion with certain people in the EPA and elsewhere. It was a very specific intentional strategy designed solely to hide and obfuscate and confuse so that they could keep selling this product and people wouldn't know but the science was really showing about the harms of it. And I think that is what was so outrageous and what has caused so many juries around the U.S. to assign punitive damages. There were one man and woman couple who sued were awarded over $2 billion by the jury because they were so outraged by the conduct.
Yeah. Wow. So to know you are doing something that's hurting and killing people, and then to cover it up I heard you mention this before. There's like emails or something of them talking about ghostwriting papers that they're going to write and have someone else put out as kind of an independent thing, right?
Exactly. They celebrated it. It was such a common strategy that they used the term very liberally in these. And they talked about how, if we say something, people will think we're biased. We're Monsanto. If we tell somebody it's safe, they're not going to really believe us. But if somebody who they don't know is affiliated with Monsanto says it's safe, if it looks like it's this independent team of scientists and this independent paper, then they'll believe that. And we'll write it, we'll edit it, we'll do all the work, but we'll get these other people who will pay money secretly to put their names on it. And that's what they did. And there's one part in the book where they're so proud of themselves for all this secret ghostwriting that they have a little party and a little celebration, and they hand out like little party gifts and things. And,
Wow. It's just amazing that they literally, it's almost like they factored into their business model, billions of dollars in lawsuits that they're going to have to settle, and just continue selling the product. They say, oh, okay, well, if we make 50 billion and we have to settle 11 billion, okay, no, it's really crazy that this is allowed to exist. And I know you also, I've heard you mention, this is super interesting because a lot of people are on social media following different health experts, things like that. And so you've seen that they literally have coordinated efforts on social media to try to take down, attack people like yourself and others who are kind of sharing the truth.
Oh, yeah, definitely. We call them trolls. Everybody has their own troll, I suppose, but definitely there are people who go through programs and they go through training, and sometimes there's money that we've seen changes hands, money that companies will, like Monsanto specifically, but others, will be paying to front groups and players. A lot of university academics have had money funneled into their programs, and then they don't disclose that money, and then they go out and talk about how great these products are, how safe they are, that kind of thing. They've recruited nutritionists and certain health professionals to get involved in this and carry their water for them, and go out and troll people like me or others. For the book Whitewash, when Whitewash came out, we found that there was a very coordinated attack right after it came out to load up Amazon, for instance, with negative reviews. And we got the documents on it. So we saw their internal plan where they assigned all of these people essentially to do this. And Amazon was able to address it because, most of the reviews said all of the same words, that kind of thing. And were not from the people who had actually bought the book. But they're able to do this sort of thing. There's something that came up called geofencing during one of the trials, where your techno wizards would understand better than I do, but it's a concept in which they can essentially kind of zero in on a demographic, geographic area where people are going to be at a trial, or where jurors are going to be walking into a trial or something, and they can control the information that comes up on search engines. Really just a lot of really interesting things that they were able to do and that they were involved in.
Yeah, it's really crazy. Really, really crazy. Let me ask you a little bit about, you were kind of boots on the ground, talking with farmers out there. And I'm curious your opinion, because for me, it seems like the incentives are completely misaligned. And it seems that Monsanto and others influence a lot of those incentives as well, right? In terms of how the farmers are growing their crops and what they're using there. What's your opinion on the way the incentives are structured and maybe some ways that we could potentially improve that?
Well, for farmers, farmers for the most part they just want to make a decent living, right? And be able to support their families and live on the land. It's the lifestyle that they love. And I guess I don't assign any blame to farmers when Monsanto and the other companies started presenting them with these, hey, you can plant these certain crops and they'll do this and you can spray them with these chemicals. And for farmers at first, they were like, this is great. This works so much better than other systems that we've used. Other chemicals that farmers were using were very, very dangerous and toxic. Glyphosate, in comparison, was less dangerous on an acute basis. There's another chemical called Paraquat that, it's so dangerous consumers can't even buy it. But a farmer could use it if they were trained. But if they would spill a little bit or it would splash into their face or their mouth, like it could kill them like almost immediately. It was so dangerous. So farmers thought this was great. So over so much time, it's affected them negatively. You've seen weed resistance, you've seen biodiversity loss, you've seen soil degradation. So they've really been harmed by the system that they embraced early on and they thought would be helpful. But the companies keep telling them, well, the solution is more and more chemicals and more and different chemicals and more. And so they're on kind of this treadmill that it's very difficult to get off unless they just want to jump and go try to be full organic, or regenerative, which is another sort of in between place. But so farmers are really both a victim and obviously they've been a driver because they embrace this. But our government, to answer your question, our government is certainly to blame as well, because at the behest of these companies and their lobbyists and their gazillions of dollars that they have spread among lawmakers and others, our public policies are very much aligned to support growing these GMO crops and monocropping and using chemical agriculture to grow food. We give so much money for subsidies and for supports and incentives to farmers to do all of these things that are not only harmful to the environment, but are harmful to the farmers and harmful to the people who are buying their food. But we're doing it because it's the policy of the United States, because the lobbyists have convinced the lawmakers they should do this. And, it's systemic and it really needs wholesale change in these policies. For instance, we subsidize corn. We push corn. Farmers grow more corn. Let's just grow corn and corn and corn and corn. Corn requires, conventionally grown corn is grown the way it's grown now. It requires a lot of chemicals and it puts off a lot of chemicals into the waterways and it's a lot of pollution and it's just a nightmare. We don't need corn. We don't need more corn. Consumers don't consume a lot of corn. Most of the corn that is grown goes to livestock feed, goes to ethanol, or sits in great big stocks, they call ending stocks, storage, that doesn't get exported, that doesn't get used, but the farmers get paid to grow it. And then they buy the chemicals that the companies want them to buy, and then the water gets polluted, and then, the soil, it's this cycle where companies make a lot of money and farmers and consumers really lose financially and health-wise.
Yeah. I think it's important for people to remember from a farmer's perspective, right? It's like if they're not using anything on their crops, they could lose, half the crop, lose and not make any money, go out of business, right? So they're thinking, oh, wow, I have now a way where I can grow more crops and not have less of a loss of those crops by using these certain pesticides or whatever it is. So for them, I think I think where it starts is the incentives. And so, I really wish, I think regenerative agriculture, farming is kind of making, hopefully it's making a comeback. Maybe it's just in my circle. Maybe just because I watch these documentaries and all this kind of stuff. Right. What was the one? Kiss the Soil is the popular one?
Kiss the Ground. Common Ground, and the third in the trilogy is Groundswell, which will be coming out soon, I think. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah. So, I mean, when you see it, when they show you the real soil, and so it's interesting. I was talking to actually a health expert recently who grows her own food, and she's like, it's all about the soil. She's telling me it's all about the soil. It's all about, the rich, moist soil and not the dry, dead soil that we're seeing these days. So, yeah, I wish there would be some sort of turnaround there. I wonder. And so I also heard, and I don't know, again, I'm not really knowledgeable enough on this. Maybe I wonder if this has come across in any of your research, but with Bill Gates being the largest farmland owner, isn't he also pushing a lot of GMO crops? And is he kind of in bed with Monsanto in some way? Or, you hear about all these philanthropic things that he's doing, but then you also hear he's the largest farmland owner and he's kind of pushing GMO crops. So what have you come across in your research, if any?
Oh, yeah. No, Bill Gates Gates Foundation has been all about GMOs. And I'm going to forget the year. It was so long ago, 2003, 4. I mean, I'd have to go back and check. But this whole initiative of Gates to really start pushing these things in Africa and to be so supportive began really when the Gates Foundation hired a chief Monsanto executive, a top level Monsanto executive, to come to the Gates Foundation and to guide them in their policy and their endeavors in agriculture. And so, yeah, I mean, you say in bed with, I mean, literally brought Monsanto into the foundation to tell them, how to move forward and to help them move forward. And they certainly embrace GMOs. Now, I'm not anti-GMO. GMOs, such great promise, right? You're genetically altering the DNA of the plant, of the crop. And in and of itself, unless, there are certain critics who are like, you should never do that. You should never mess with Mother Nature in that way. But early on, the promise was, we're going to make foods more nutritious. We're going to make them drought tolerant. We're going to make them more appealing to children to eat, or we're going to make them resistant to pests so that they, you don't have to spray insecticide. They'll naturally be toxic to the pest. I mean, there are a lot of those out there. People have concerns about them. But, or the potato that, the apple that doesn't brown and the potato that doesn't get a disease and those sorts of things. And you have seen these other types of genetically modified crops. But from the outset until, way back in the 90s until today, the vast majority of the trait that is the most widely used around the world, that is the most widely embedded in genetically engineered crops, is herbicide resistance, which means spray right over those crops, douse them in pesticides, douse them in the weed killers, which means that the weed killer stays in the plant and it stays in the fruit of the crop and it stays in the food that you're consuming or that your livestock is consuming.
Sounds like we need to make a GMO. Sounds like we need to make a GMO that can withstand, that doesn't need any pesticide spraying, right? Let's make a GMO that grows on its own without needing any chemicals.
There you go, without any. Well, and they thought that they had solved that for insects with this BT corn, with this type of corn that, again, sort of put the insecticide right into the plant itself. So you wouldn't spray it with an insecticide. The plant itself would be toxic. So that raised a whole bunch of concerns about, well, what does this really do for then the animals that consume the, crops grown this way? And of course, Mother Nature adapted and the insects became resistant, which is the same thing that's happened with GMOs that are tolerant of weed killers. The weeds have become resistant. And we now have over 1 million acres in the U.S. of farmland where the weeds are resistant. And so farmers are now having to spend money either hand weeding, hiring labor. There's a whole movement to try to have new kinds of like electric zappers or robots or other kind of weed killers. Or they're doing what a lot of farmers are doing, and they're just spraying more and more and more types of weed killers right on their crops.
Oof. Yeah, that's rough. Oh, yeah. Man.
So
So yeah, and I heard some. I might be butchering the stat, but I heard something like 90% of non-organic corn that is sold in the U.S. is GMO. Very, very
it's
high number
90% of corn grown in the U.S. is GMO.
is GMO,
Yeah.
including yeah. So the only way to really know for sure, well, I guess if it said non-GMO on it, but really organic is the way that you would know that it's non-GMO for sure.
Organic and non-GMO. Yeah, I mean, there's
Yeah.
obviously the non-GMO label, um,
Hmm.
but it's such a small fraction. And again, it's the policies aren't there to support these practices, these regenerative and these organic practices. We do have obviously some money, and we've seen increases in recent years about money going to incentivize. Um, but it's such a small fraction compared to the incentives that are going to the conventional, what they call conventional practices, which are the chemical heavy practices. And I recall interviewing a government agronomist a few years ago about these programs. And he said, yeah, we're really trying to get people to move away from pesticide use, to reduce it or move away from it. But we're not allowed to say that. We're not allowed to tell them it's bad. We just have to kind of like dance around it. Because it's been the policy of the U.S. for so long to be a champion for these companies that sell these chemicals.
Are there any other foods that people listening to should really watch out for when it comes to heavy pesticide spraying, GMO, that kind of thing?
Well, we've done stories. I've done a lot of stories looking at FDA reports and getting internal FDA documents and things, and uh, you can see high pesticide levels, in a lot of processed foods, crackers and bread, and I mentioned oats, anything made with oats, oatmeal products, which you might give to children a lot. Unfortunately, I did a series of stories about this too. The FDA secretly did some testing of honey samples from around the U.S., including organic. They just went to grocery stores and pulled them off shelves and found, these illegally high levels of pesticides in almost all the samples, including the organic samples. So it's really difficult. Fresh fruits and vegetables, typically, if they're grown conventionally, are going to carry a lot of residues of pesticides. There's a really easy way to look at it. You can go to the FDA and the USDA, both every single year put out reports about pesticide levels in foods, and because they monitor this every year, because they know the way we grow our food leaves these chemicals in our food supply, and they monitor it, and you can read all about all the different kinds of chemicals, weed killers and insecticides and fungicides and all these things that are in green beans and apples and peaches and blueberries, and it's unappetizing for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. And you mentioned with the honey, even the organic honey, and that I think could be just from bees like cross pollinating, right? They're getting a flower here that's getting sprayed, and then they're going back there and making the honey. So that one's kind of a tough one. Yeah, wheat, I'm sure, is a big one. I believe that corn, wheat, and soy is like pretty much the majority of what farmers are producing in our country, and heavily spraying there. So yeah, a lot of times when people say, "Oh yeah, when I go to Europe, I can eat bread," but over here, you eat bread, it ruins your gut health and everything else, right? All sorts of other problems. I personally had to stop eating. I went paleo back in 2013 after having massive inflammation and pain in my fingers and arms, and when I seemed to cut out a lot of those carbs and a lot of those processed foods and heavily pesticide sprayed foods, and just stuck to more cleaner stuff, it made a huge difference for me.
Oh yeah, it really does. And a lot of my work focuses on food and farming, obviously, so I'm looking at the inputs and the agricultural chemicals like the pesticides. But that's not all we have in our food, right? We always have all these different additives as well, and the colorings and the preservatives and things. a lot of which are not allowed in Europe or other countries, but they're allowed here in the US. We just had, the example of red dye number 3, which was linked to cancer 30 years ago, and it is known to be a health hazard. But our EPA only, was it a week ago, 2 weeks ago, finally said, oh yeah, we should probably get rid of that. So,
Right.
they were actually forced legally by a court to do it. But so it's this combination of things. I don't think you can just point to, oh, it's red dye number 3 that makes our food, makes us sick, or it's this one chemical. I think it's this combination of all of these just toxins that we want to put in our food to make it cheap and, taste good, all these different sodiums and sugars and all of these things that really are not good for our health, but, are like crack for our taste buds. And make food a lot cheaper because we're not getting food, we're getting chemical additives. So yeah, and I'm the same way. I go to Europe. I love to go to Italy. We travel quite a bit in Europe, and you can eat to your heart's content, and you don't feel bad after, like you do here.
Yeah, yeah. And there's some other things as well that are outlawed. I heard you talk about that there's something that's outlawed in China, but it's actually owned by a Chinese company, and they basically just export it to the US and countries all over the world.
Well, there's probably a lot. We're probably talking about Paraquat, which is
Yeah.
the weed killer I mentioned earlier, that is so acutely toxic, that it poisons people, that it kills people. It's used as a suicide tool, for God's sakes, has been by many people, because just a tiny teaspoon in your mouth will kill you. But it's a very effective weed killer. And it's made by a company. There are several companies now, but the lead one that introduced it and made it, manufactured it and marketed it and worked with the EPA has continued to push it here in the US, even though it's been tied to a whole range of different diseases, including Parkinson's disease. But it's banned in 70 countries, including China, and it's a Chinese government-owned company.
Wow. Yeah. So ban it in your own country, sell it everywhere else. It's just like, what, you've done a lot of work here, like what's your, if RFK and the new president came to you and said, all right, how do we fix this problem? What do you say?
Yeah, somebody smarter than me has to do that, right? I think the very first thing is, and it'll never happen, right? We have to get the money out of Washington. It can't be that whoever has the biggest wallet, has the biggest influence with our lawmakers and with our policymakers. There's so much corporate meddling and influence peddling and industry just driving their self-interested policies, so that the interests of the little people, the consumers, the American public, are not really represented. You have different organizations like the Environmental Working Group, which sponsors the news outlet that I now run, the new lead, that really work hard to represent the interests of the public, and a whole lot of other organizations. But they're so much smaller and have so much less money and fewer resources than do these companies that are making billions and billions of dollars and spreading it all over Washington, D.C. I don't know how we're ever going to get policies that truly represent the interests of the people when we allow our lawmakers to be so beholden to these big companies. Now, Bobby Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., I know him a little bit. I've spent time with him, had lunches and breakfast with him and talked to him about his views. I do think on food, like, he feels very strongly, that we have to do that we have to have more accountability, that we have to have transparency, that we got to get all this crap out of the food system. I don't know how well that's going to work in the Trump administration. It seems to be a real contradiction with other policies and other strategies that are going on there. I don't know, but something has to change, certainly.
Mm.
It's been a bipartisan problem for decades. You've seen, no matter who's in the White House, you've seen this corporate capture, really, of our regulatory agencies. Now, Obama tried, a bit. There was a whole issue with scientific integrity, and that word gets bandied about, and we're going to rely on the science, and we're going to keep out corporate influence. But it hadn't worked. I mean, we've had whistleblowers come out of the EPA not too long ago talking about how they try to write scientific assessments of new chemicals that companies want to put out on the market, and they're finding that these chemicals that they want to put out are going to cause cancer or other disease or birth defects or infertility. And their higher ups, the management at the agency, make them change the report or kill the report or suspend the scientist, or because it's a corrupted system, and it really has to change. Somebody's got to figure out a way.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think there should be some real severe penalties. Some people might need to be made an example of over there at Monsanto. And I will say, for the first time, I mean, this is the first time I've ever really heard or seen an administration put someone in place that's like, hey, like, I'm actually kind of hopeful right now with RFK. For the first time, I was like, for so many years, it's like, this stuff is so obvious, banning these dyes and, not spraying our things with toxic chemicals. It just seems so obvious. And finally, we have someone who's is aware of this and actually wants to make a change, and seems to be that they're giving him authority. So I would say, for the first time in my lifetime that I've been, following this stuff, I'm hopeful. Again, like you said, it's going to take a lot of change. It's going to take a long time. It's going to be how do you stop all the incentives and lobbyists and all that kind of stuff. I think it's tough. I do want to ask you real quick about, so Africa now is obviously a new growing market for farmers. And so they're going there and kind of doing these same practices down in Africa? Tell us a little bit of what's going on there.
Well, yeah, and this is certainly not recent. I mean, this has been decades now, at least over the last 15 years, 20 years, that Africa was identified as a key emerging market for these big companies to push their products, to push their pesticides and push their GMO crops, and teach African farmers how to farm. Obviously, there's been a lot of taking over of lands by other companies, sort of this imperialism coming over, where companies are taking over and pushing out small landowners there. And it's been quite a controversy in Africa, and a debate there. Do we allow in, do we bring in this modernization and look to the West and, look to these big companies to guide us, or do we try to hold on to our own cultures and our own practices? And it's been just a battle back and forth for so long. But I mean, clearly this conventional agriculture has been making headway over there, much to the upset of critics. I wrote about, in September, I worked with a journalism group out of the Netherlands and sort of a global team of journalists, and we were able to expose what was really kind of an ugly organization, but a U.S. company that actually the founder of it came from Monsanto, but a U.S. company whose sole purpose really was to help push this agenda, this U.S. agenda and this big corporate agenda in Africa and other developing countries, by spreading false and negative information about critics of chemical agriculture and critics of GMOs, to basically try to discredit them and to make their arguments invalid. And they had memberships and they had secret profiles of people. And it really was like a dirty little tricks, bag of dirty little tricks, kind of CIA operate, like a very in the dark kind of operation that these people were running. And we saw they got government contracts. They were getting money from the U.S. government to help fund their dirty tricks, to try to push this mission in Africa and elsewhere. So again, it's the stuff stuff that sounds like a conspiracy theory until you see the government contracts and you get the emails and it's not, and it's really upsetting to a lot of people.
Yeah. Yeah, well, look, this has been really eye-opening stuff. I think it's important for people to be aware of. I think people need to know about this stuff. We need to, hopefully, enough voices speak up and we start making some change here. There's been some productive, hopefully productive protests recently going on at a bunch of companies. People have organized and going to companies saying, why are you using different ingredients in Canada and Europe than you're using here in the US? And when you know that these ingredients are dangerous. So hopefully we can continue that trend and kind of, strong arm these companies to do the right thing if enough people speak up about it. So I'm hopeful about that.
Yeah, no, definitely. You definitely see a lot as people become more educated and informed and engaged. There are different groups and leaders and even just people individually taking action, speaking out, talking to their neighbors, making changes, what they buy, voting with their pocketbook. It takes a village, right? Who coined that phrase? So
yeah. Well, Carey, this has been absolutely eye-opening. I think it's been very interesting. I highly encourage people to check out your books. And where can people follow you, learn more, pick up your books?
So, great. Yeah, thank you. I have a website, careygillam.com, CareyGillam.com. You can find out more. I started working with the Environmental Working Group I launched a news outlet called The New Lead a couple of years ago, LEDE, The New Lead. So you can look at that. I write a lot for The Guardian. You can see the articles there. And I'm always looking for news tips. So you can contact me off my website. And we're just really trying to get behind the scenes and expose what people need to know about their food and farming so that we can all be healthier and our kids can be healthier. So I welcome input from everybody.
Amazing. Yeah, that's good. Maybe we'll get you some hot tips from someone listening to this podcast.
Please, yes.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for everything you're doing. We need people like you. And by the way, you've, just so people are listening, this takes a lot of courage to do what you're doing. So I really want to commend you. I mean, you've put yourself out there. You've gotten, I'm sure, hate mail, hate speech, trolls on the internet, people who probably know your address and things about you and your family that you wouldn't want them to know. I've heard you talk about this before. And I mean, so it's really, really impressive. We want to really thank you for having the courage to do this. A lot of people would just say, I don't want to mess with those companies. Let me go hide. So really, really impressed by what you're doing and really want to thank you for everything you're doing.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yep. They came hard at me and, so I'm glad that's sort of subsided a little bit. Let's hope it stays.
Until the next book.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, thank you so much, and I hope we can do this again sometime.
All righty. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, can you please leave us a rating or review and subscribe? I've realized that while we have actually increased our downloads a lot, we're actually getting a lot of downloads, which I'm really happy about. We actually have very few ratings. And I realized that I've never asked people really to rate much. So I'm asking you now if you could please rate and review and subscribe. And if you enjoyed the episode, please forward it along to anyone that you think will get value out of this. Also, if you haven't checked out our line of products at buypeakperformance.com, you get 20% off your first order. That's www.buypeakperformance.com. We have some incredible products, including our organic high-altitude coffee. If you don't know this, coffee is one of the most heavily sprayed with pesticides out of any crop. So it's really important that you drink organic coffee. We've gone above and beyond to source what we believe is the highest quality and healthiest organic coffee in the world. We're also famous for our organic green superfood powder. You can get 20% off of that as well at buypeakperformance.com. We also have an organic vegan and paleo plant protein. See, most of the vegan proteins out there are using brown rice protein, which is really not a good source of protein, and it's also a grain. And if you're paleo, you know that grains tend to cause inflammation in some cases for some people. And so we wanted to make one that was paleo friendly and vegan and organic. We made an amazing amino acid profile, so it's really one of the best plant proteins for muscle building. So you can check out Peak Performance Organic Plant Protein. You can find that on our website. Of course, all our products are on Amazon as well. So thanks again. And again, please, if you enjoyed the episode, please forward it along to someone who you feel can get value out of it. And please leave us a rating, review, and subscribe. Thank you.